Good morning, good evening, good night, and a warm welcome to all our viewers and listeners wherever you are on the globe. It's a great pleasure to open the third and last session in our three series webinar on Israel after the Afghanistan crisis, the new geopolitics of the Middle East. I'm Eli Reches. I'm the Crown Visiting Professor at Northwestern University. I'm head of IIP, the Israel Innovation Project, and I'm also the Israeli agent at the Office of the Vice President for International Relations. As I said, this is the third session in our mini conference, and we'll be discussing today the impact which the Afghan crisis has had or will be having on new regional configurations. We want to focus on Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the Palestinians. All this considering, of course, the Abraham Accords, which have transformed the region so significantly. An administrative comment, those who missed or registered and couldn't attend the earlier session, and also this one, will be able to follow the full recording on IIP's website and on YouTube. So I'd like to mention and highlight the fact that this event is the outcome of long-standing collaboration between Northwestern Israel Studies and Tel Aviv University, our institutional partner. This particular series is co-organized with the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tel Aviv University, headed by Itai Sened. I should add that IIP, my project, is particularly focused on technology and science. However, we are currently immersed into the study of Israel's history, politics, and this is one example of what to do. This is a good opportunity for me to thank Crystal Falcaro-Hibbs, IIP's program assistant, for her relentless efforts to make this happen. And without her help, this venture wouldn't have taken place. The moderator and participant today is my colleague and friend, Yael Aronoff. As she takes the helm, she will introduce our three other distinguished speakers, whom I already thank for agreeing to take part and participate in our program today. So let me say a few words about Yael before we start our journey. Yael Aronoff is Professor of Political Science, International Relations at Michigan State University. She's the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel, and is the Serling Chair of Israel Studies at MSU. I should add personal note that since the institute, I think, was restructured, if I'm not mistaken, you'll correct me, Yael, it has been incredibly active in promoting Israel studies activities, programming, teaching, and so forth. So Yael served as the president of the Association of Israel Studies, AIS, from 2019 to 2021. Her research explores dilemmas concerning means of war, conditions under which wars end, and the influence of domestic politics on foreign policy. Her books are The Political Psychology of Israel Prime Ministers, When Hardliners Opt for Peace, and Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond. She's a popular speaker, has given over 100 public lectures, and I assume this will be the 101. So without further ado, I finished my part. I give the mic to Yael, who will introduce the speaker and moderate the discussion as it comes by. So Yael, please.
Thank you so much, Eli Reches and Northwestern University and the Israel Innovation Project for organizing this wonderful panel and timely panel. We Hope to have a very stimulating discussion, and I'll pose some questions to our esteemed speakers, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll open it up to some questions that you can post in Q&A as well. So let me first introduce our esteemed speakers. First is Dr. Ebtesam al-Ketbi, and she's the president and founder of the Emirates Policy Center, which is one of the most important think tanks in the Arab world. Dr. al-Ketbi is a professor of political science at the United Arab Emirates University. She was appointed in 2015 as a member of the Consultative Commission of Cooperation Council of the Arab States of the Gulf, the GCC. She was also chosen in 2018 in the list of 50 most influential women in the Arab world. And in 2019, Dr. al-Ketbi received the Woman Super Achiever Award during the World Women Leadership Congress. And in 2021, she was chosen as an advisor in the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy. Next, we'll hear from also Professor Rabi, who's the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies and professor of Middle East History at the Department of Middle Eastern and African Studies, a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's the director of the Tel Aviv University Workshop, an annual 10-day seminar for international scholars that focuses on the geopolitical situation of Israel and its neighbors, and co-editor of Bustan, the Middle East Book Review. His research focuses on the modern history and evolution of states and societies in the Middle East, Iranian-Arab relations, oil and politics in the Middle East, and Sunni-Shiite dynamics. We'll also hear from Aaron David Miller, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy. For more than 2 decades, he served at the Department of State as a historian and Middle East analyst and negotiator himself in Republican and Democratic administrations. He is CNN Global Affairs Analyst and the author most recently of The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. He also authored The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace, which I recommend to everyone and I've used very much in my own research and teaching. So let's get started with the questions and the discussion, and hopefully we'll get everyone who's attending to be able to post some questions towards the end. So first, let me start with you, Dr. al-Ketbi. It has been just over a year since the signing of the Abraham Accords. To what degree are the normalization agreements thriving? What factors, perhaps Iran, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or other factors, do you think are crucial in explaining the success or lack thereof of normalization? And what ways could they be strengthened and expanded?
Well, first, thank you for having me with you. It's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar. I think 1 year on, we can say that Abraham Accords have been transformational. They have started to contribute to reshaping the future of Middle East and the region. Despite challenges, the Accords remain capable of providing transformational momentum. The Accords revealed a monumental shift in the approach to Middle East conflict. Now we are talking about a normalization relations between Israel and 4 Arab countries in less than 3 months. These shifts began with the UAE and Israel announcing a peace treaty in August 2020. Now, this is starting a domino effect on Arab, Muslim, and other countries. Now, although the Emirati-Israeli treaty never claimed that it has resolved the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it was described as a historical moment or historical breakthrough. Of course, there is no consensus in the Middle East on this step related to the most prolonged conflict in the region. The Palestinian leadership rejected the agreement, and there have been many varying viewpoints on this issue. In contrast, it can be argued that these new agreements would have a significant impact on the signatories. Now, to these accords and the entire Middle East region and border international scene. Now, course, there have been challenges, and Gaza war was a big challenge for that accord, especially for UAE. And from UAE perspective, the challenge now is how to engage the Palestinian National Authority and Palestinian in a new peace process and find to end the crisis. Now, I would say also the other challenges, intra-Palestinian division, are also among the challenges that face the Abraham Accords. Moreover, some political leadership and forces on both sides are manipulating the conflict for electoral poses. The other, of course, challenge in both sides, now we have it, and it will be more worsened by Afghanistan, I would say, the extremists on both sides, in Israel, in the Palestinian side, and with the Afghans now, of course, with al-Qaeda coming back, with ISIS also on the top of the scene, with the American withdrawal, with the vacuum there. There are also, they will use the Palestinian cause, of course, to for more extremist activities against those signatories to the Abraham Accord. So I think also that the challenge will be how the more successful this normalization process. It also depends on both sides, the Israeli side and the Arab side. But when I'm saying the Israeli side mostly, because how can you stop the extremists on the Israeli side from, because there are spoilers. Hamas are spoilers, Iran is spoilers, also the extremists inside Israel are spoilers for this accords. Now, the success of this, it will depend on how to both of these signatories to manage those, plus how can you make it a win-win situation so you will convince the others to join. When I'm saying the others, the Palestinian and even the Iranian, if they find themselves, they are a winner in this game.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pose a couple questions to our other panelists and then come back to you with more questions, and then have time also for you all to respond to each other. Next, I'll pose a question to Erin Miller, and this also relates to some of the things that Dr. al-Ketbi was just talking about. What do you think are the most important factors shaping the Biden administration's potential influence on leaving the door open to a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians? And how might the US leverage its stronger relationship with the Gulf countries, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia and others, in order to work on some issues cooperatively and multilaterally, and hopefully move towards resuming future negotiations with leadership or providing conditions for those future negotiations? How might the withdrawal from Afghanistan be a factor here? Could it influence dynamics among Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and regional actors like Egypt and Jordan? So it's a great follow-up to what Dr. al-Ketbi was just talking about. We'd love to get your insights from your experiences and scholarship.
Well, thanks, Yael, and thanks for moderating this and for your kind words. It's an honor for me to be here with Eli Reches, with Ebtesam, and Uzi on this panel. How can I begin? Let me begin, I guess, from a fundamental point of departure with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and then move to a comment or two on the Biden administration. I'll speak very, it's a cruel and unforgiving world with respect to America and the Middle East. So let me be as brutally honest as I possibly can. There are three factors necessary to create an environment for a serious negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, let alone to reach an agreement. Those three factors have never aligned. They don't align now. And the prospects that they will align in the future are virtually, in my judgment, non-existent. I will say, having worked on this issue for the better part of my professional life and offered some wise at times advice, but a lot of bad advice to secretaries of state and to presidents, I haven't given up hope that a conflict-ending solution between Israelis and Palestinians is still possible. But I have given up what remained of many of my illusions when I was working on this issue. There are three factors that are critically important, and they're all missing. And there are no prospects that these three factors are going to align in order to create circumstances for, and I choose my words carefully here, a conflict-ending solution. One is the absence of leadership. In order to have any chance of resolving this issue, you need leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners over their ideologies or their own politics. You do not have leaders on either side of the Israeli-Palestinian divide, or constituencies, frankly, that are prepared to support the kinds of decisions that must be required if, in fact, a conflict-ending solution is to be achieved. Number two, in any negotiation, it's been my experience that negotiations succeed or do not succeed based on the degree of what I call ownership. That is to say, local ownership that pertains to each side. And when I say ownership, I mean precisely this, that in this case, Israelis and Palestinians care more about taking the kinds of steps to create a negotiating framework to protect it, and then to make the decisions that are ultimately required in order to move toward a solution. The kinds of ownership that exists now is simply insufficient to create such a process. There is a wonderful expression, I don't know who termed it, but it's a wonderful piece of philosophy, and it's simply this: in the history of the world, it is said nobody ever washed a rental car. And there's a reason you don't wash rental cars, because people care, sad or not sad, only about what they own. And there is insufficient ownership on the part of each constituency, let alone their leaders, to even begin to imagine how the core issues of this conflict, border security, refugees, Jerusalem, end of all conflict and claims recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, to even begin to imagine a negotiating process that would have a chance of succeeding. Every breakthrough in this conflict, without exception, Israel-Egypt, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Palestine, were all done without the participation of the United States. Each negotiating framework, whether it was Dayan's secret negotiations with Sadat's vice president, whether it was Israeli-Jordanian contacts, which preceded the establishment of the State of Israel and continued for decades discreetly and secretly, or whether it was the ill-fated but heroic effort in the Oslo Accords to reach an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, all of these occurred without the participation of the United States. I was on vacation on the west coast of Florida in August of 1993 when I received a call from the State Department Operations Center telling me to come back to Washington immediately. We knew about the Oslo Channel. We had no idea that it was as close as it was to actually making a decision. So without leadership and without ownership, which are the two critical ingredients, I would argue, of any negotiation success, prospects are limited. That brings me to a third missing ingredient, which is effective US mediation. I would simply argue to you the last time we had a serious policy with respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict was the first Bush administration. I had the honor of working for then Secretary of State James Baker. It was a procedural breakthrough, to be sure, 9 trips, 9 months to Madrid, but it foreshadowed the kind of diplomacy that was required by the United States. And that diplomacy was based on 2 ingredients applied quite liberally. One was the application of honey, understanding the needs and the requirements and being prepared to provide the assurances to each side should they reach an agreement. And the other was vinegar, necessary pressure at certain points, if and when the parties reached the point where gaps could be closed. Those gaps today are as large as the Grand Canyon. So that brings me to a final point that I will make on the Biden administration. If Joe Biden were on this call, he probably would be sort of stunned by the nature of the questions with respect to the American role, because he would simply argue to you, if he were prepared to be brutally honest, that there was no foreign policy issue out there today, certainly not the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that was more potentially damaging or dangerous to the future of the republic and the future of his presidency than the 3 or 4 internal, he won't call them crises because it would feed into his Republican opponents, but the 3 or 4 challenges that confront the United States right now. And that leaves a very, 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 how many varies can I impose here? Narrow bandwidth for this president, this presidency, and this administration to expend on a cause that isn't even remotely ready for prime time. If there was a Middle Eastern issue out there that needed attention, it is bound to be an issue that directly affects, I'll say it again, directly affects the security, prosperity of the United States. And what we've seen over the last decade and a half is that the issue of Palestine has essentially become very much localized. You could barely argue that it even is the most disruptive issue in a region that has offered up so many manifestations of dysfunction, terror, and violence. So unless there was some evidence, some event, either of a positive nature or a negative nature, and there are plenty of those, it seems to me it's going to be extremely difficult to get the Biden administration interested in what I call a full court press on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That doesn't mean they don't have a policy, they do, but certainly not one that is going to take this issue on with the kind of power and force and influence that is required, assuming that the conditions are there for making progress, substantial progress, and they're not. So let me stop here.
Thank you for those sobering comments, and we'll follow up on those in the next set of questions. But first, I'd like to get to our next speaker. And for you, Professor Uzi Rabi, it seems that one of the factors influencing both the emergence of the Abraham Accords and the strengthening of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, UAE and Israel, is that all these countries are balancing Iranian influence in the region. How has the withdrawal from Afghanistan influenced perceptions of this need for greater regional cooperation to counterbalance Iran? Does the US withdrawal from the region enhance the drive for cooperation among states in the region and enhance the prospects of greater, perhaps Saudi influence, UAE influence? Perhaps there's a fourth factor. Aaron Miller was talking about the 3 necessary factors, and these can't replace the necessity for active US mediation. Perhaps there can be a greater role for regional actors here. Or would Saudi Arabia pursue strengthening relations with China or Russia?
Let me start with thanking the organizers for having me here. I mean, it's a real pleasure to have with my co-panelists, Ebtesam and Aaron, and thank you, Yael. And yes, I mean, my take is there is a sort of a storm in the Middle East. I would depict it as the shifting sense of Middle Eastern geopolitics. And the Afghani saga actually stand to prove that things are on the move. In my opinion, there are several competing visions in the Middle East when it comes to 2020 or 2021. We have the Iranian vision, we have the Turkish vision, and then we have the others vision. What I mean to say is that, and I hope I won't sound, it's not that simplistic as it may sound, but you know, we are very familiar with the Iranian vision. We do see the suffering actually of weak Arab states where the Iranian actually are tearing them down. And this is something that nobody can ignore. And there should be no mistake about that. Look at Lebanon, look at parts of Iraq, look at Syria. That would tell you actually part of the story. We have Turkey with Erdogan and all this idea of Muslim brothers, which is becoming sort of a flag by which Turkey and others in the region are trying actually to make some inroads for themselves. Thanks God, this ideology is experiencing a retreat, if to see what's going on in Tunisia, Morocco, and elsewhere. But this has become kind of a worldwide, I would say, movement. And this is kind of a very controversial vision also for the Middle East. Now, let's put aside ISIS, al-Qaeda, and all these professional troublemakers who are using religion in order to promote either political ambitions or apocalyptic visions. There is something that happened a year ago in the Middle East. People tend to belittle it. I don't know why, but everybody has his own reasons or her own reasons. This is the Abraham Accords. This is the only positive vision that had been introduced in the Middle Eastern landscape. And I can tell, because I have that in abundance, this is an unheard of precedent of what's going on between Israel and some Arab states. The notion is, why not? The notion is actually, let's have a full-scale cooperation, not only geopolitics. I agree with you, Yael, that everybody is so fearful of Iran, and Iran is threatening everybody, that this has become kind of a common denominator by many to forge an multilateral alliance by which to counterbalance Iran. I mean, that would be very, very understandable. But I mean, on top of that, while looking at the Abraham Accords, you're going to see that much beyond the geopolitical element, you have kind of a cooperation on so many other spaces. This is why I say it's unheard of. It's high tech, it's technology, it's climate changes, it's so many things. And for me, actually, in the academia, we just actually, have this MOU with research centers in Abu Dhabi, in Manama, in Bahrain. And this is something that is very, very interesting because it has to do with the people-to-people dimension. This is not something Israelis whatsoever, even for a single day, have managed to have with Jordan and Egypt. And I'm not going to belittle the very importance of the peace treaty of Israel with Egypt and Jordan, but this is a different opera. So here's what I think. When it comes to the Saudis, for example, I mean, they are at the bay in a way, because what happened in Afghanistan goes against their interest. And everybody knows that this is not actually the one-time rivalry between Iran and Taliban, as was the case in 1998. Iran in the recent decade has managed to cultivate sort of a relationships or working relations with portions of the Taliban. Now the Saudis, maybe Emiratis and others, would have to have kind of a stronghold here, there, in order to have some bargaining chips when it comes to Russia, China, or to make sure that the Iranians are not coming up with igniting, factors in Afghanistan against them. We should also bring in Pakistan into the picture, because Pakistan is becoming highly important and imperative in that regard when it comes to Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf states vis-a-vis Afghanistan. But, while these are tactics, when it comes to what I think actually multilateral alliances, this is definitely high time for many Arab states, including Israel, to start thinking of something which goes beyond the Abraham Accord. I would love seeing actually many things that are, are there, but can come to fruition when it comes to Jordan, when it comes to Egypt, when it comes to even Palestinians. If we're gonna have something which is based on this multilateral workshop, we're gonna actually benefit everybody. Yes, we have, and I do agree with Aaron actually saying that there are very many obstacles when it comes to the Palestinians. I do agree with him that America is very choosy. I don't see the Americans actually coming in or penetrating the Israeli-Palestinian landscape in kind of a very creative manner and create kind of a change. In my opinion, what the Americans are dealing with in the Middle East is just the Iranian file. And even there, they might find many problems, as we do see. What the Americans did in Afghanistan, I mean, this poor performance, this is what I know. This is something which is a real bother for pro-Western players in the Middle East. I would say that this is something that is not cheerful, actually, or not something that somebody could be happy with when it comes to the Gulf, when it comes to Morocco, when it comes to even Egypt, Jordan, Israel. And this is why I think that states are becoming much more, or forced to become much more creative in forging their future strategy by compiling those alliances. There's a lot going on there. I'm not sure that this would come to fruition in kind of a formal alliance, but the one who knows actually could definitely talk about many, I would say, interactions on so many levels between anti-Iranian / at times anti-Turkish players in the Middle East. And this is something that created a sort of a precedent when it comes to the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East. I do hope that what we have here is not only a set of challenges, which are definitely there, but there is also a glimpse of hope. A glimpse of hope because, in my opinion, some Arab states have got the message. They know that if they would like to better deal with their future survival, they have to come up at time. It's a U-turn, leaving behind all these slogans of the 20th century and start dealing with the situation as it is when it comes to the 21st century. And let me remind us one more thing. I'm not talking necessarily about the hard dimension of security. Security today is something that needs a broader definition as to include so many elements that are part and parcel of what we call the soft power. Climate changes, scarcity of water, stuff that is at the top priority of so many players in the Middle East. Not to mention all this cyber stuff and high-tech devices. This is something...
Sorry, to finish your sentence, I just wanted to thank you. So,
so I'm saying that what we got here is kind of a security in its broader manner, and this is all the more reason why states actually should align themselves together when it comes to the 21st century. And I think that we do have kind of a direction in this regard.
Right. So you describe a lot of the challenges, but also hope, point to areas of cooperation and hope. And I was going to ask you to maybe follow up on what's been said in that regard, Dr. al-Ketbi, and also look at kind of elaborate on ways the United Arab Emirates might influence Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries to extend normalization with Israel. How might this be leveraged to move either towards a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, or given the challenges that have been outlined, at least providing kind of conditions through greater areas of cooperation, as Dr. Rabi was mentioning as well. Just a small kind of emblem of that, I just like to say, is at MSU, we had Justice Richard Bernstein speak, who's on the Michigan Supreme Court, and he spent 3 months in the United Arab Emirates and 3 months in Israel, building work on kind of empowering people with disabilities in both countries, and all the work that can be done in that regard. So there are all these areas of cooperation, right? Whether it's climate or business or cultural or these kinds of networks as well. Could that form kind of a strengthened relationship that, if extended to others, can at least form some of the conditions that Aaron Miller said might be necessary? Or, could this be a fourth factor, as I was saying, right? So Aaron Miller was saying we need leaders. I'm all for that, right? Having written about that, you need the ownership, as he says, you need active American mediation. But now can we have kind of empowered regional actors, given kind of a less active American role, that kind of can take that space actually and be a fourth factor that, in coordination with the United States and others, actually is what the catalyst we need to move things forward.
Is this for me, Yael?
Yes, that's for you.
They're putting on the table
By the way,
many issues. So which one you want me to start with?
That's for you. And for the second round of questions, if you guys can limit, these are all big questions, but if you can limit it to just a couple minutes so that we have time for a second round, and then you're responding to each other and maybe a couple questions from the audience. So yeah, try to, because we had longer answers for the first question, so you could try to limit it to shorter answers.
Well, yeah, I mentioned before, before it was Gaza war, many countries were going to join the normalization. Gaza war put off many of them because of the Arab public opinion. Also, I mentioned UAE was, and of course, with the media coming from Al Jazeera and other Qataris outlets, okay, shaming everybody, and so we in UAE have got very hard time. But I think the government was a believer that and through normalization you can bring peace to this region. This is different between what Ozzy mentioned, Jordan, Egypt, because we had no war with Israel. So it was easy, even people to people, to move on. There is no constraints now. Regarding Saudi Arabia, also they were in that train. But you mentioned that does UAE has a leverage on Saudi Arabia? No, they don't have. But if you remember, all of us remember, in the beginning, Saudi Arabia opened its sky for the Israeli flight to cross. They were willing. But Saudi Arabia also, comparing with UAE, it's a huge country, okay? And it has heavy constraints, not like UAE, slim and can move and dynamics, okay? This constraints that they are the custodian of the Holy Shrine, and there are many conservatives and religious elites inside Saudi Arabia. So it cannot move easily. Plus, of course, they are also present in their initiative that, Bahrain got something, UAE got something, whoever got something, Sudan got relief from the sanctions. So what the Saudi they are going to get when they sign this Abraham Accord? This is also a question. And when I'm saying they are imprisoned with their initiative, so they are maybe looking at accepting the Saudi initiative, or they call it the Arab initiative. So this will give them excuse in front of their people. And here I want to say something about that initiative or any another. initiative. You know, I think we are all imprisoned in our old thinking, not creating something based on the fact on the ground now, in terms of two-state solution or the peace process and initiative, many initiatives. Maybe we need to think, even the American. I don't know if the American now, of course, they are busy with their internal politics, with their pivoting toward China. China is more important for them than the Middle East or even the peace process. So we need to sit and think in a creative way. How can we reach peace in this region, peace between the Palestinian and Israeli, abandoning the old initiative and thinking. Now, looking to the future, I think we should also put the glass of the young generation, the new generation, those whom they are going to take the lead after us. I think this is the bet on the young generation, not the old generation, on both sides, the Palestinian side and the Israeli side and then the Arab side, even in the Iranian side. I mean, the young generation looking for something else, not what the religious elite is trying to deprive them from it. They look to the future. They want to be like the American, like others, like even the Emirati, whom they are on the next to them, enjoying their life. So I think the vacuum the American left in the region, it mainly leaves the small countries like Israel, UAE, Jordan, okay, in a dilemma how to manage, and of course how to can navigate between these two giants, China and the American, where you have interest with both, and now the American, they are putting constraints on their allies that not to deal with China, and they are leaving, and China is coming from the window, okay, and this is something also you need to discuss in this region, the vacuum in Afghanistan filled by the fanatic and the extremists. So, and the Americans are leaving and they are not paying attention for that. So also those Iranian Gulf issues, Israeli-Iranian issues, Israeli-Palestinian issues, Israeli-Arab issues, this is need to be discussed within the region and not looking for always the helpers from the other great powers to help the region.
Thank you so much. Continuing with that, I'll give it to you, Aaron Miller. You said that one of the challenges was leadership, and of course there's nothing immediate that we can hope for, but looking at possibilities and not necessarily immediate likelihoods, do you see any possibility for a game changer if, you know, Hamas put Marwan Barghouti on the prisoner exchange list for a ceasefire with Israel? He has in polls, the most recent polls, he would win the next Palestinian elections if he ran over any other current contenders. Would that be a possible that he would have the legitimacy? And as Dr. al-Ketbi said, he's kind of relatively from a younger generation compared to Mahmoud Abbas. In terms of, you know, the budget passed for the first time in 3 years in Israel today. And so Lapid has a perhaps increased chance of actually getting to his rotation of prime minister. Obviously, he'll be restrained by Bennett if that happened. But are there some kind of possibilities with that or thereafter in kind of a next government? In terms of a long-term ceasefire with Hamas, does Egypt's kind of greater interest in improving relations with the US and other factors make room for cooperation for at least a possibility on that front? So I'm going to say, what I'm looking to you is some possibilities in terms of changes in the factors that you mentioned, whether it be leaders or other things, and looking kind of at a smaller scale at conditions on the ground in terms of, at least if you can't have negotiations today, some things that could be improved, either kind of with regional cooperation or otherwise. Again, if you could keep it to just 2 minutes or 3 minutes.
Again, I spent the last 18 years out of government trying to bring a measure of honesty and clarity to a situation that is often muddled. With the best of intentions, people are looking for all kinds of magic bullets and fixes that would somehow create a better environment that would allow an Israeli and a Palestinian leader to emerge to make the kinds of decisions required. There are no magic fixes or bullets. There's the propensity and the prospects of an eruption of violence, but pain has always been a handmaiden of this process. Without prospects of gain, the status quo will remain more or less what it is, with some variation, some accommodation, some efforts to improve the situation on the ground, the so-called shrinking the conflict or the bottom-up approach. But violence will also accompany it. We've seen 2008-09, 2012, 2014, conflicts between 27 and 2021, conflicts between Israel and Hamas. So yeah, there are always factors, but I don't see any. And I would challenge anyone to paint a picture in which you had a degree of certainty tethered to any of the factors, Yael, that you identified that would somehow fundamentally change this equation. Life doesn't work this way, which is one of the reasons we are where we are with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People have never been willing to, I think, strip it all away and sort of determine what is in fact required in order to move it forward. I mean, I was at the last best effort to resolve this conflict. 14 days in July of 2000 at the Camp David summit. That was a summit that never should have taken place, because it was based on a series of illusions about what would be required by each side to set a table for an American mediator willing and able, which we were not, willing and able to close the gap. So no, I don't believe any of this, frankly, is going to change the situation. I would like, though, to comment just briefly on one, because I don't want our expectations to get out of control with respect to the Abraham Accords. They are, as I see them, extraordinary, but they're all very different. You, in fact, do have a transformative relationship between Israel and the Emirates. There's no question about it. And you've got an emerging relationship between Israel and Bahrain. But the Israeli-Moroccan relationship is limited in fact in what it can produce. And the Israeli-Sudan relationship is now fraught as a consequence of internal developments there. I would only point your attention to the fact that however new and however impactful the Israeli-Emirati Accord has been, when it came time in crisis in May of 2021 for an Arab state or combination of states to play a critically important role in diffusing the worst violence between Israelis and Palestinians in years, it was not the Bahrainis, it was not the Emiratis, it was not the Moroccans, and certainly was not the Sudanese. It was Egypt. And you cannot replace, I don't care how transformative the Emirates relationship with Israel becomes, you cannot replace the critical factors of geography and politics and somehow bestow upon the Emirates this new role. The Emirati role in the peace process is going to be limited. It's going to be limited because of the Emirates' hostility toward Hamas. It's going to be limited because the Emirates now provide a home for a former colleague of mine, Mohammed Dahlan, who is one of Abu Mazen's erstwhile rivals. And as long as the Emirates support Dahlan, they support the prospects of fundamentally changing the Palestinian leadership. So the Emirates' role in the Israeli-Palestinian issue is highly, highly limited. Again,
I just want to thank you. Like, if you want to wrap up with a couple sentences, we just have 9 minutes left in the.
I'm done.
Okay, so yeah, and it may be that it's not either. You make insightful points, but it might be either Egypt or UAE. But you actually are expanding the actors that can have influence, even if it's a greater or lesser influence, depending on different issues that might move things forward. Granted the limitations that you speak of. Professor Rabi, how might the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan affect perceptions and lessons learned by different Israeli and Palestinian leaders, and then their policy preferences, and how might it affect Iranian perception? So now we're bringing kind of the Israeli, how these things affect the Israeli-Palestinian front to you. I know you were also pessimistic, but does it kind of change anything in terms of perceptions? And then, since we only have, if you could answer that in 2 minutes, then I'm going to kind of point last three questions. After you're done, I'll point three last questions. You can choose what you want to answer in a couple of minutes, how you want to conclude, how you might want to respond to each other. And then I see one question in the Q&A that I'll pose as well. So Dr. Rabi, if we can get your short perspective on that.
Yeah, well, in my opinion, this is a different opera, what we got today. It's not the 20th century anymore. Palestinian issue is not that instrumental in geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Yes, there is a problem, but the problem is of both Palestinians and Israelis, and they have to deal with that. And nobody has managed even actually to move it forward as we had seen. What I'm trying to say, Aaron, Egypt is highly instrumental. Abraham Accord is an auxiliary will. What we got here is people to people, as I said before, something which makes many Israelis very excited, because we haven't had this before. And many Israelis now know that there are states in the Middle East of Arabs and Muslims who could respect the otherness of the other, as we do see that day by day. I'm not saying that this is a winning formula, but Abraham Accords, together with Egypt, which is so instrumental, and everybody knows Egypt has some other problems than Palestinians and Israelis. It is Libya, it is scarcity of water, it's Ethiopia, and we have, thanks God, a full-scale plate of cooperation with Egypt. What I'm trying to say is that one sentence, Taliban, Lebanon, this is where you go or heading when you align yourself with the bad guys. That's the lesson. We have a lot of problems. Many United Arab Emirates have a lot of problems. But what we have managed to do is just to put that aside and just try to think maybe we have a win-win play that we have actually to capitalize on. And thanks God, it goes on. This is not the solution, but it's one step in the right direction. This is how I put it.
Okay, I'm going to pose kind of three quick questions and one from the audience to you, and you can choose whether to answer that question or respond to something else that was said. Again, if you can try to limit it to a minute, and I know it's hard for all of us to do that, but for you, Dr. Ketbi, one would be that Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has kind of talked recently about this greater kind of alliance, possibly between Israel and Egypt and Jordan and Morocco and the UAE and Greece and Cyprus and so forth, and trying to form this kind of coalition that could try to work together in a variety of directions that may also perhaps facilitate Israeli-Palestinian peace, although that's not the main motive, it's for other issues. So that, and maybe you could talk about that. Aaron Miller, the one thing I would pose to you is you have, I loved your book and you have all this great experience with Camp David, but of course there were subsequent negotiations in 2001 and 2008. Perhaps the Olmert deal came close. And when you say the gap is as much as the Grand Canyon, there's some that would argue that actually and Shlomo Ben Ami and Saeb Erekat and others argued we more or less know through these thousands of hours of negotiations and thousands of papers that come since that actually gaps have been narrowed in terms of these things and are doable, and it's more the political will and conditions that are missing. So I want to push you on that. And for you, Dr. Rabi, if you might talk about the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, which includes Israel, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, the Palestinian Authority. Are there kind of potentials for strengthening this? Is that impacted at all by the Taliban takeover? And lastly, there was one question in the Q&A from Klislu. He asked Dr. Ebtesam, given that there's only 1 year that the accord has been implemented, do you think that the UAE, Bahrain, or Morocco needs more time to set the priorities in accordance with their national interests and with their public acceptance and response from Saudi Arabia? Or do you think that the Gulf states would be pushed too hard? So in a sense, like, you know, what factors into implementing it, taking into account kind of public acceptance and so forth? So you have 4 questions. You can pick one or respond to something else as you make your concluding comments. And you certainly have given us a lot to think about, both in terms of challenges and in terms of opportunities. So Dr. al-Ketbi, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I have comments on what Aaron said, and I will answer your question regarding the joint between Egypt and Morocco and Greece. First, Aaron, yes, might be UAE won't be the main player in the peace process, but if the peace process will be tangible and coming, it's not Egypt who's going to finance the reconstruction. It will be UAE, of course, will be the Gulfists whom they will be looking for to put their money for reconstruction. Now, I think each one of them has a role. Egypt, of course, because of its border with Gaza, it has to be involved. Even Jordan also, we cannot ignore Jordan itself. Now, I think that as I'm still saying that Abraham Accords are a game changer in the region. So the Abraham Accords will necessarily lead to a new arrangement at the strategic level. It will support regional stability and help establish regional cooperation projects with strategic dimensions in the region, including the Gulf, Mediterranean, and the Red Sea regions. These accords can help reshape the Middle East and establish links among the people of the region. This is why the Abraham Accords can be described as transformational, given their ability to create a new dynamics in the Middle East, shared by Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Morocco, Greece, Cyprus, Bahrain, and perhaps Sudan after its move to a stable situation. So it will particularly be the case if these relations leave a positive economic impact that can embolden the expansion and even such a strategic axis. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Aaron Miller, if you could sum up some of this.
Yeah, I mean, again, I understand, and I spent the last 18 years trying to create a realistic frame, annoyingly negative as it may be. It's real. It's not untethered from the sorts of hopes and aspirations we all had. And again, I have 2 grown children. I have no intention of giving up hope, but we can't afford illusions any longer. The notion that everybody knows the outcome, so what's the problem, I think is in essence a fair statement of the problem. That statement that everybody knows the outcome was certainly relevant in 2000. It was probably relevant in 2008 in Annapolis. It may or may not have been relevant in 2014 at the end of the Kerry Initiative. The real question is whether it's relevant now. I would only identify one piece of empirical evidence, and that is the looming extraordinary manifestation of an American decision as to whether or not it should reopen its consulate in Jerusalem, closed by the Trump administration. The fact that this issue has now loomed as a major point of friction between the United States and Israel, with the Israelis arguing that it is a Trojan horse designed to lay the groundwork for dividing the city and establishing a capital in East Jerusalem, and the Americans arguing that it is a necessary step to what? Recreate a measure of confidence and trust with Palestinians, should be evidence enough about how far the conflict has deteriorated and how distant the prospects are for, yes, Yael, you're quite correct, it's political will. It's always been about political will, never about the diplomatic fix. But I would only say I'm wondering whether or not the diplomatic fixes on Jerusalem, border security, refugees, and recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, with all of that, all the implications that that portends, whether or not the traditional approaches on any of these issues are still possible. I raise that as a question. I don't have any.
No, and it certainly is tragic about the Palestinian consulate's reintroduction, but with the coalition apparently, holding on still being extremely vulnerable, their argument may be, if you just wait a year for Lapid to be prime minister, then you can make a lot more progress beyond the consulate. We can only hope that that's the case. I'll try to look for optimism in these things, but it's certainly a tragic situation as you outlined. Dr. Rabi, what are your concluding, comments in terms of?
Oh, you just mentioned the Mediterranean gas project. Here you have another manifestation of how states beyond the Middle East, and the Middle East is kind of a changing phenomenon, a changing geopolitical creature. We do see that what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in the Mediterranean. You have Italy, Greece, Cyprus. Greece and Cyprus, anti-Turkish players. You're going to go to Tel Aviv or Haifa and Gaza and even Lebanon and definitely Egypt. All these states have vast amount of gas in their offshore. The simple fact that you can use the Mediterranean, extending the landscape of the Middle East, and create kind of a project like that. Remember, Yael, states are being benefited from that. What we're going to see in 2-3 years is more interdependence of state on that very profitable ventures. I hope that we're going to see that more and more. Those who are still thinking of how to solve out the Palestinian-Israeli problem are going to be left behind. We are moving to the 21st century. This is a different platform. And I have to tell you that this is, of course, my hope, but I do believe that we're going to see in this coming decade and the coming decades, as long as I can see that, we're going to have some other, set of priorities for Middle Easterners. And this gives me hope that things are going to be changed, not dramatically, but gradually. That is my hope. And I guess that everybody would share actually at least this hope with me, because we do need kind of different period, much more tranquil when it comes to the Middle East.
I think we all share that hope, but also hope for peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Definitely.
Even if
that would be part of that.
Of course.
No, that would be part of that. Definitely.
Right. Well, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking discussion. It kind of leads me. I'm going to go with my class today that's just heard you, and we'll continue talking about some of these things as we talk about some of our other readings. And I'm sure all the attendees will keep thinking. Thank you, Lerekas, and let you make some concluding remarks for this organizing.
Very briefly, naturally, thank you. I'll come to the thank you in a minute, but 2 thoughts that went through my mind. First, I was once taught that any panel discussion that ends with disagreement is a good one. So I guess we had a good example of that today. Number two, it's a Chinese proverb that every journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So what we've seen here are different viewpoints and interpretations. And I think such that reflect the reality in the Middle East. I should add parenthetically, it gives me, as a program director, more appetite to do more of this and to delve even deeper into many of the questions that came up. I would like to now thank each one of you personally and the whole group as a panel discussion for a very, very stimulating, illuminating, and widespread array of issues that you have raised. And I want to hope that we'll meet again. We'll meet again in this framework or another. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye.